What if being too perfect was the very thing that destroyed you? A massive, dark brown stallion stood in the center of an auction ring, magnificent and flawless, yet completely unwanted. Every breeder who saw him turned away. Every buyer passed him by. He was too big, they said, too much. An impossible creature in a world that demanded practicality. Then, one aged man with calloused hands and a failing farm made a bid no one expected, and what followed would reveal a truth about worth and purpose that no one saw coming. This is a story about finding value where others see only burden. If you believe that every creature has a destiny, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more stories of unexpected miracles. The livestock auction grounds in Redfield County sprawl across 12 acres of packed dirt and weathered infrastructure. A place where animals are reduced to lot numbers and selling prices. The main barn is cavernous, its metal roof echoing with the sounds of nervous horses and the drone of the auctioneer's rapid-fire patter. The air is thick with the smell of manure, sawdust, and the anxiety that all auction animals carry in their bodies. This is a place of transaction, not sentiment. A place where beauty is measured in bloodlines and utility, where an animal's worth is determined by how much profit it can generate. Outside, the September sun beats down mercilessly, baking the parking lot until the asphalt seems to shimmer. Trucks and trailers fill every space, their owners moving between pens with clipboards and calculating eyes. These are professionals, breeders, and dealers who know horseflesh the way a jeweler knows stones. They can spot a flaw at 50 paces, can calculate feed costs and training time and resale value in the space between heartbeats. They are here for business and business alone. In the holding pen behind the main barn, separated from the quarter horses and thoroughbreds and steady ranch mounts, stood an animal that defied every practical category. He was a draft cross, part Percheron, part Belgian, standing 19 hands at the shoulder. Massive, towering. His coat was dark brown, the rich color turned earth, and his mane and tail were pure black, thick as rope. His legs were like tree trunks, his chest broad enough that a man could stretch both arms across it and not reach the other side. His hooves were the size of dinner plates, feathered with black hair. He was built like something from another era, when horses pulled artillery through mud and hauled loads that would break lesser animals. He was magnificent in a way that made people stop and stare, then shake their heads and walk away. His name, according to his intake papers, was Atlas. The name was a joke, perhaps, or a warning. He'd been bred by an ambitious farmer in the northern part of the state, a man who'd thought he could create the perfect draft cross, an animal with size and strength and just enough refinement to be marketable. What he'd created instead was something too large, too expensive to feed, too impractical for modern agriculture where tractors and machinery had replaced the heavy horse. The breeder had tried for 2 years to sell him, had advertised him in farm journals, had brought him to shows, had dropped his price again and again. Nothing. No one wanted a horse that ate 50 pounds of hay a day, that required custom equipment for everything, that couldn't fit in a standard trailer or stall. Atlas had become a beautiful, expensive mistake. The auctioneer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker announcing lot numbers, calling bidders to attention. Atlas stood in his pen with his head high, watching the activity around him with intelligent, dark eyes. He'd been to auctions before. He knew the pattern, the nervousness, the prodding, the parade into the ring while strangers assessed him like merchandise. He knew, too, that he always came back unsold, loaded back into the trailer with the same handler who'd brought him, driven back to the farm where he lived in expensive limbo. But this time felt different. The handler who'd brought him, a tired man with a worn face, had told him goodbye. Had actually said the word, his hand on Atlas's powerful neck, his voice rough with something that might have been regret. This time, someone would buy him. The reserve price had been dropped to almost nothing. Someone would take him, even if it was just for meat weight. The thought should have frightened him, but Atlas had lived too long in uncertainty to feel much of anything anymore. He simply stood and waited, as he'd been trained to do, for whatever came next. In the crowded bleachers surrounding the auction ring, Raymond Cole sat with his hat pulled low and his hands folded on his knees. He was 58 years old, weathered by decades of farm work and financial struggle. His face was lined like a map of hard miles, his hands scarred and calloused from a lifetime of labor. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the color had nearly disappeared. His boots were old but carefully maintained, the leather cracked but clean. He looked like what he was, a small-time farmer barely hanging on, a man who'd worked himself to the bone and had little to show for it except a failing property and mountain debt. Raymond hadn't come to the auction planning to buy. He'd come to sell his last good-breeding mare, a gentle quarter horse he'd raised from a foal. The decision had torn at him for weeks, but the numbers didn't lie. He couldn't afford to keep her anymore. Couldn't afford the feed, the vet bills, the luxury of animals that didn't earn their keep. His farm, 40 acres of rocky soil in the eastern part of the county, had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the barn with his own hands. His father had worked the fields until his heart gave out at 62. And now, Raymond was watching it all slip away. One failed, harvest at a time, one unpaid bill after another. His wife had left 2 years ago, tired of poverty and worry, tired of a husband who loved a piece of land more than he loved comfort or security. His son lived in the city, working an office job, embarrassed by his father's stubborn adherence to a dying way of life. The mare had sold for less than Raymond had hoped, but more than he'd feared. The money would cover 1 month's mortgage, maybe 2 if he was careful. It was a temporary reprieve, nothing more. A delay of the inevitable. He should have left after the sale, should have collected his check and driven home to the empty farmhouse and the empty barn. But something made him stay, some stubborn refusal to acknowledge that this chapter was ending, that the life he'd built was collapsing. He sat in the bleachers and watched lot after lot parade through the ring. Horses of every size and color, each one finding a buyer, each one moving on to whatever came next. Then Atlas entered the ring, and every conversation in the building died. The massive stallion walked through the gate with his handler struggling to control him, not because Atlas was fighting, but because his stride was so large that the man had to jog to keep up. Atlas stopped in the center of the ring, his body filling the space in a way that made everything else seem small. The overhead lights caught the dark brown of his coat, making it gleam like polished wood. His black mane fell across his neck in thick waves. He stood perfectly still, his head high, his eyes scanning the crowd with a dignity that seemed almost human. The auctioneer's voice, usually confident and rapid, faltered slightly. Lot 47, folks. Draft Cross Gelding, 19 hands, 5 years old. This is a big boy, as you can see. Strong, sound, good temperament. Starting bid at $500. Silence. The kind of heavy, uncomfortable silence that fills a space when everyone is thinking the same thing but no one wants to say it. $500 for a horse that would cost $1,000 a month to feed. $500 for an animal that had no practical purpose in the modern world. $400, the auctioneer amended, his voice dropping. Who'll give me $400? More silence. Atlas stood motionless, and if a horse could understand humiliation, Raymond thought, this one did. He could see it in the animal's eyes, the knowledge that he was being rejected again, that his magnificence was exactly the problem. 300. Come on, folks, this is quality horse flesh. $300. Someone in the back laughed, a cruel sound quickly stifled. The auctioneer's face reddened. This was embarrassing for everyone involved, a reminder that even beauty had its price, and sometimes that price was too high. 200. Let's not waste time here. $200 and we move on. Raymond felt something shift in his chest. A familiar ache, the same one he'd felt watching his father work himself to death for this land, the same one he'd felt signing the papers to sell his mare. It was the ache of watching something valuable be diminished, be reduced to numbers that didn't capture its true worth. He thought about his empty barn, about the 40 acres that would likely be foreclosed on within the year. He thought about his son who'd stopped visiting, about his wife who'd stopped believing, about the slow death of everything he'd tried to build. And he thought about this massive horse standing in the ring, unwanted and alone, worth so much more than anyone could see. His hand went up, a single decisive movement that cut through the silence like a blade. 200, he called out, his voice steady despite the insanity of what he was doing. The auctioneer's gavel came down so fast Raymond barely had time to process what he'd done. Sold to bidder 73 for $200. Next lot, please. Atlas was led out of the ring, and Raymond sat frozen in his seat, his heart pounding, his mind screaming that he'd just made the stupidest decision of his life. He couldn't afford this horse. He couldn't afford to feed himself most weeks. But even as the practical part of his brain cataloged all the ways this was a disaster, another part whispered something different. Maybe this wasn't about practicality. Maybe sometimes you save something not because it made sense, but because letting it be destroyed would cost you something more important than money. He went to the cashier's window and paid with the money from his mare's sale. All of it. Every last dollar. The woman behind the counter gave him a look of pity mixed with judgment. Raymond took his receipt and walked to the loading area, where Atlas stood tied to a post, his massive head turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Their eyes met, and Raymond felt that strange sense of recognition that passes between beings who've both been deemed insufficient by a world that measures worth in all the wrong ways. "Well, boy," Raymond said quietly, "I guess we're both too big for our own good. Too stubborn to quit when we should. Let's see if that's enough to keep us both alive." The drive back took 40 minutes. The trailer swaying behind his ancient pickup truck. The farm appeared as they crested the last hill. 40 acres of stubborn earth framed by weathered fences and a barn that leaned slightly to the left. It looked like what it was, a place slowly dying. Raymond backed the trailer up to the barn and lowered the ramp. Atlas walked down, his hooves striking hollow sounds, then stopped and looked around, taking in his new home. Raymond led him to the largest stall and removed the halter. The horse barely fit, his head nearly touching the ceiling. He moved to the water trough and drank deeply while Raymond leaned against the stall door, feeling the weight of his decision settling over him. He had no plan, no idea how this would work. He'd bought a horse he couldn't, afford out of some misguided sense of solidarity with a creature as out of place in the modern world as he was. "You hungry, boy?" Raymond asked, though he knew the answer. He climbed the ladder to the hayloft, his knees protesting, and pushed one of the precious bales down. It landed with a thud that raised dust from the barn floor. He broke it open and distributed it in Atlas's stall, watching as the horse immediately began to eat, his massive head buried in the hay. 3 bales. That was all Raymond had. At the rate Atlas would consume it, they'd be gone in days. Then what? The sun was setting when Raymond finally left the barn and walked back to the house. The kitchen was dark, cold. He sat at the table where 3 generations of his family had eaten their meals, where his wife had finally told him she couldn't do this anymore. The silence was profound, broken only by the tick of the old clock on the wall and the distant sound of Atlas moving in the barn. Raymond had never felt more alone, or more certain that he'd done the right thing, even if he couldn't explain why. The next morning arrived cold and gray. Raymond woke at dawn, made coffee in the battered percolator, drank it black because he'd run out of milk 2 weeks ago, and walked out to the barn. Atlas was standing in his stall, alert and watching. The hay from last night was gone, consumed completely. Raymond hung another half bale in the feeder, watching his resources dwindle with each passing hour. At this rate, he had maybe 4 days before he'd have to figure something out. He spent the morning working on fences, repairing sections that had sagged and broken over years of neglect. It was mindless work that allowed his thoughts to drift. He kept circling back to the same question. Why had he bought Atlas? It wasn't rational. It wasn't smart. Or maybe it was the action of a man who'd been losing so long he'd forgotten what winning looked like, and needed to save something, anything, to remember that salvation was possible. Around noon, a truck pulled into his driveway. Raymond straightened, hammer in hand, squinting against the sun. His heart sank when he recognized the vehicle. Tom Henderson, his neighbor to the south, owner of 300 acres of productive farmland and a man who'd made no secret of his contempt for Raymond's failing operation. "Raymond," Tom said, nodding curtly. "Tom, what brings you out here? Heard you bought a horse at auction yesterday. Wanted to see if it was true." News traveled fast in rural communities. Raymond set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his jeans. "It's true. Got him in the barn." "Can I see him?" Raymond wanted to refuse, wanted to tell Tom to get back in his fancy truck and leave, but rural courtesy ran deep. He led Tom to the barn, where Atlas stood in his stall, his massive head turned toward the visitors. Tom stopped dead in his tracks, his expression shifting from skepticism to genuine shock. "Jesus Christ," Tom breathed. "That's the biggest damn horse I've ever seen. What the hell are you going to do with him?" "Haven't figured that out yet," Raymond admitted. Tom walked closer to the stall, examining Atlas with the practiced eye of someone who understood livestock. "He's built like a freight train. Must eat you out of house and home." "That's about right." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to face Raymond with an expression that was almost pitying. "You know the bank's foreclosing on you next month, right? I heard it at the feed store. You're 3 payments behind, and they're done extending credit." Raymond felt his jaw tighten. "That's my business, Tom. It's going to be my business when they auction off this place and I buy it," Tom said bluntly. "I've got plans for these 40 acres. They connect my north and south parcels, make the whole operation more efficient. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price if you want to sell directly. Avoid the embarrassment of foreclosure." "Not interested." "Raymond, be reasonable. You can't make this work. You couldn't make it work when you had resources. What makes you think you can do it now, with an animal that costs more to feed than most people's mortgage? Sell me the land, take the money, and start fresh somewhere else. There's no shame in it." "I said I'm not interested." Raymond's voice was hard, final. The conversation was over. Tom shook his head, the gesture somehow both sympathetic and condescending. "Your pride is going to be the death of you, Raymond. That and your inability to recognize when you've lost." He walked back to his truck, and just before climbing in, he called back, "Nice horse, though. Shame you won't have him long." The truck pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the still air. Raymond stood in the barn doorway, Tom's words echoing in his head, 3 payments behind, 1 month until foreclosure. He'd known it was coming, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but hearing it stated so baldly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. He looked at Atlas, who was watching him with those knowing eyes. "You and me both, boy," Raymond said quietly. "Too big, too expensive, too much trouble for anyone to want to keep us around." Atlas huffed, a sound that might have been agreement or simply acknowledgement. Raymond moved into the stall and ran his hand down the horse's powerful neck, feeling the muscle and bone beneath the skin, the sheer magnitude of life contained in this animal. He'd saved Atlas from the kill pen, but for what? To bring him here to starve slowly while Raymond lost his farm. What kind of salvation was that? The days that followed established a rhythm of desperate maintenance. Raymond rationed the hay, giving Atlas enough to survive, but not enough to truly satisfy his enormous appetite. He walked the fence lines and repaired what he could. He avoided town, avoided the judging eyes and the pitying whispers. And he talked to Atlas, long one-sided, conversations about the farm, about his father and grandfather, about the weight of legacy and the cost of holding on to things that maybe should be let go. Atlas listened, or seemed to, his ears flicking toward Raymond's voice. His body relaxed in the presence of this quiet man who'd saved him for no reason anyone could understand. On the 5th day, Raymond woke to find the hay completely gone. He had $37 in his bank account. A bale of hay cost $15, and Atlas needed at least 2 bales a day. The math was simple and brutal. He couldn't feed him, couldn't keep him, couldn't even sell him. Raymond sat on the edge of the loft, his legs dangling over the side, and for the first time in decades he let himself cry. Quiet tears that ran down his weathered face and dripped onto the barn floor below. He'd failed his family, his farm, and now he was failing this magnificent animal who trusted him. He was still sitting there when he heard the trucks, multiple vehicles, the sound of engines and tires on gravel. Raymond walked to the barn door, shielding his eyes against the afternoon sun. 3 pickup trucks were pulling into his driveway, and behind them a flatbed loaded with hay bales. People began climbing out, Bill and Martha Crane from the farm 2 miles north, young Kevin Ross from the feed store, the Presbyterian minister, and others he didn't recognize. Strangers who'd somehow heard his story and decided to show up. They moved with purpose, unloading hay bales and stacking them in his barn with the easy efficiency of people who understood physical labor. Bill Crane approached Raymond, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Heard you had a big horse eating you out of house and home," he said, his tone casual. "Figured you could use some help." "I can't pay for this," Raymond said, his voice rough. "I don't have money for—" "Nobody's asking you to pay," Bill interrupted. "Sometimes folks just help because it's the right thing to do. You'd do the same if positions were reversed." Raymond wanted to argue, to maintain his pride, but he looked at the hay being stacked in his barn, enough to last weeks, and the words died in his throat. He nodded once, unable to speak. When they finished, Martha Crane approached with a covered dish. "Pot roast," she said simply. "You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in a month." She pressed it into his hands and walked back to her truck. The vehicles pulled away one by one, leaving Raymond standing in his driveway, holding a pot roast and trying to understand what had just happened. He walked to the barn and looked at the stacked hay, evidence that maybe he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. Atlas stood in his stall, his head high, looking at the abundance with what might have been satisfaction. "Guess we're not done yet, boy," Raymond said quietly. "Guess there's still some people out there who think we're worth saving." The unexpected help bought Raymond time, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. He still had no income, no way to sustain himself or Atlas long term. He spent his evenings sitting with Atlas, finding comfort in the horse's massive, peaceful presence. They'd developed an understanding, these two misfits, a silent companionship born from shared rejection and stubbornness. 2 weeks after the community's generosity, Raymond received a visitor who would change everything. A small sedan pulled into his driveway, unusual in a place where everyone drove trucks. A woman emerged, perhaps 40 years old, wearing jeans and a sensible jacket, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had the look of someone who worked outdoors, comfortable and confident. She approached the house, and Raymond met her at the door, wary of visitors who might be bringing bad news. "Mr. Cole, I'm Dr. Jennifer Hayes. I work with Meadowbrook Therapeutic Center about 30 miles south of here. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Raymond nodded, his guard up. "What's this about?" "I heard about your horse, the big draft cross you bought at auction. Is he here?" "He's in the barn." "Why?" Dr. Hayes smiled, and it was genuine, reaching her eyes. "I'd like to see him, if that's all right. And then I'd like to talk to you about a proposition that might benefit both of us." Curiosity overcame caution. Raymond led her to the barn, and Dr. Hayes stopped in the same place Tom Henderson had stopped, her mouth falling open in genuine awe. "My God," she breathed. "He's even bigger than I heard. He's perfect." "Perfect for what?" Raymond asked, confused. "For therapy work. Let me explain." She turned to face him, her expression animated. Meadowbrook is a therapeutic center for children and adults with disabilities. We use horses as part of our treatment program, equine-assisted therapy. It's proven to help with physical therapy, emotional regulation, confidence building. But we have clients who are too large for our current horses, adults with significant disabilities who need something bigger, steadier, stronger. When I heard about Atlas, about a 19-hand draft cross with a gentle temperament, I knew I had to meet him. Raymond shook his head. "You've got the wrong horse. Atlas isn't trained for anything like that. He's just a pasture horse. No special skills." "I'm not looking for special skills," Dr. Hayes said. "I'm looking for the right temperament and the right size. From what I've heard about how he behaves with you, he might be exactly what we need. Would you be willing to let us evaluate him? Just a trial, see how he does with our staff and clients. If it works out, I'd like to lease him from you. We'd pay for all his care, feed, veterinary, everything, plus a monthly lease fee. You'd still own him, but he'd live at our facility and work in our program." Raymond felt his heart rate accelerate. This was impossible. Too good to be true. "Why would you want to do this? There must be other horses." "There are other horses." Dr. Hayes interrupted gently. "But there aren't other horses like Atlas. His size isn't a problem for us. It's an asset. And from everything I heard about you, Mr. Cole, about how you bought him when no one else would, about how you've cared for him despite your own difficulties, I think he's been treated with kindness. Horses remember kindness. They respond to it. That matters in therapy work more than any amount of training." Raymond looked at Atlas, who was watching this conversation with his usual calm intelligence. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Dr. Hayes said. "Let me give you my card. Take a few days, talk it over with Atlas." She smiled at that, acknowledging the absurdity and the truth of it. "If you decide you're interested, call me. We'll set up an evaluation. No commitment beyond that." She left her card and departed, and Raymond stood in the barn holding a small rectangle of paper that might represent salvation or might be just another false hope in a long line of disappointments. He walked into Atlas's stall and sat down in the hay, his back against the wall, looking up at the massive horse who'd somehow become the center of his life. "What do you think, boy? You want to be a therapy horse? Help people?" Atlas lowered his head and nudged Raymond gently, a gesture that might have meant anything or nothing. But Raymond chose to interpret it as agreement, as hope. 3 days later, Raymond called Dr. Hayes and agreed to the evaluation. A week after that, he loaded Atlas into a borrowed trailer and made the drive to Meadowbrook Therapeutic Center. The facility was beautiful, 30 acres of rolling pasture with a modern barn and an indoor riding arena. Everything was clean, well-maintained, clearly run by people who cared about both their animals and their clients. Dr. Hayes met them at the barn, along with her head trainer, a young man named Jake who had the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up around horses. The evaluation lasted 3 hours. They led Atlas through the facility, introducing him to new sights and sounds. They tied colorful ribbons in his mane and tail to see if he'd tolerate decoration. They brought out wheelchairs and walkers, letting him acclimate to equipment that might frighten other horses. They even had a small child approach him, supervised by multiple adults, to see how he'd react to unpredictable movement. Through it all, Atlas remained calm, patient, gentle in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if he understood that these people needed him to be careful. The moment that sealed his fate came near the end of the evaluation. A teenage boy in a wheelchair approached Atlas, and the horse lowered his massive head until he was at the boy's eye level. The kid reached out with a trembling hand and touched Atlas's muzzle, and something passed between them, some wordless communication that everyone watching felt but couldn't name. The boy started crying, not from fear, but from something else, something that looked like relief, like recognition. Dr. Hayes looked at Raymond with tears in her own eyes. "He's perfect," she said simply. "If you're willing to let him join our program, we'd be honored to work with him." The terms were generous, more than generous. They would pay all of Atlas's expenses, provide him with top-quality care, and pay Raymond a monthly lease fee that would cover his mortgage with money left over. It was salvation, wrapped in the unlikely package of a horse that everyone else had rejected. Raymond signed the papers with hands that trembled slightly, and when he said goodbye to Atlas that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because he was giving up, but because he was finally winning. Atlas settled into his new role with a grace that surprised everyone except Raymond. The massive horse seemed to understand instinctively that his size, once a liability, was now his greatest asset. Children and adults who needed extra support, who required a horse broad and steady enough to hold them securely, found in Atlas exactly what they needed. He stood motionless during mounting, his enormous body absorbing the awkward movements of people whose own bodies didn't work the way they wanted them to. He walked with careful precision around the arena, attentive to every shift in balance from the rider on his back. And he seemed to sense when someone needed extra gentleness, lowering his head and moving with exaggerated slowness when his rider was frightened or uncertain. The transformation in the clients who worked with Atlas was remarkable. A woman in her 40s who'd suffered a stroke began to regain core strength and balance from riding him. A boy with autism would sit on Atlas's back and find words he couldn't access in any other setting. A veteran with PTSD discovered that an hour with Atlas left him calmer than any medication had managed. Word spread through articles in local papers and a regional magazine photo essay, bringing increased donations to Meadowbrook and allowing them to expand their program. And at the center of it all was a dark brown draft cross who'd been deemed too big, too impractical, too much for anyone to want. Raymond visited every week, making the hour-long drive to watch Atlas work, observing from the viewing area as the massive horse carried client after client with impossible gentleness. The lease payments saved Raymond's farm, allowing him to pay off his mortgage arrears, buy supplies, and even begin planting again. His son visited for the first time in 2 years, shocked by the changes, and they worked together for an afternoon fixing the barn roof. It was a start. Raymond even went on a date, awkwardly accepting an invitation from Martha Crane's sister. Nothing came of it, but it reminded him that he was still capable of seeing possibilities instead of just counting losses. But the real transformation was in how Raymond saw himself. For years, he'd defined his worth by productivity, by his ability to maintain the farm and honor his family's legacy through relentless work. When he'd failed at that, he'd internalized it as proof that he was insufficient, too old, too set in his ways. Buying Atlas had been an act of solidarity with another creature deemed insufficient, but what he hadn't expected was that saving Atlas would somehow save him, would show him that worth wasn't measured in productivity or profit, but in something more essential: kindness and refusing to accept the world's narrow assessment of value. On a cold morning in late November, Raymond stood at the fence of Meadowbrook's main pasture, watching Atlas graze with the other therapy horses. A small group of children approached, and one little girl with leg braces pressed her face against the fence and called out to him. Atlas walked over and lowered his enormous head until he was at her eye level, and she reached up with both hands and touched his muzzle. Her face transforming with joy so pure it made Raymond's chest ache. Dr. Hayes came to stand beside him. "He's changed lives," she said quietly. "Every person who works with him leaves different than they arrived. That's what Atlas teaches, that being different, being too much, can also be exactly what someone else needs." "Thank you," Dr. Hayes said, turning to face him, "for buying him, for giving him a chance when no one else would. I don't think you know how many lives you saved that day." Raymond looked at her confused. "I only bought one horse." "You bought one horse," Dr. Hayes agreed. "But you saved so much more than that. Every client who works with Atlas, every family member who sees their loved one smile again, every person who discovers they're capable of more than they believed. You saved all of them. And you saved yourself, whether you realize it or not." The little girl was still talking to Atlas, telling him secrets in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear. The horse stood perfectly still, His ear flicked toward her voice, listening with the same patient attention he gave to everyone who sought his company. And Raymond understood, finally, what Dr. Hayes meant. He hadn't just saved a horse. He'd saved the possibility of connection, of hope, of believing that the things the world discarded might be exactly the things someone else desperately needed. As winter settled over the farm and the therapeutic center, as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, Raymond found himself thinking often about worth and purpose. His farm was stable now, but modest. He would never be wealthy, would never have the resources that men like Tom Henderson possessed. His son visited occasionally, their relationship slowly healing but still fragile. He was alone most evenings, eating dinner in a quiet house, living a life that most people would consider lonely. But he'd learned something essential in the months since buying Atlas. That salvation often came dressed in unexpected clothing, that the most impractical decisions could yield the most profound results, that being too much for one world simply meant you belonged in a different one, where your size was strength and your difference was exactly what someone needed. On a clear December evening, Raymond drove to Meadowbrook for his weekly visit. The facility was decorated for the holidays, lights strung along the fence lines, a wreath on the barn door. He found Atlas in his stall, contentedly munching hay, his massive body relaxed and at ease. Raymond let himself into the stall and sat down in the hay, leaning against the wall in the position that had become familiar. Atlas finished his hay, then walked over and lowered himself to the ground beside Raymond, a gesture that took the old farmer's breath away. The massive horse lay in the hay, his legs folded beneath him, his great head resting near Raymond's shoulder. They sat together in the warm quiet of the barn, man and horse, both of them rescued from fates they'd been told were inevitable. Both of them proof that the world's assessment of value was often profoundly wrong. Both of them exactly the right size for what life had asked them to do. Raymond reached out and placed his hand on Atlas's neck, feeling the pulse of life beneath the skin, strong and steady and sure. "We did it, boy," he whispered. "Everyone said we were too much, too big, too impractical. Everyone said we couldn't make it. But here we are, still standing, still mattering, still exactly enough." Atlas exhaled, a long breath that might have been agreement or simply contentment. In the warm darkness of the barn, with the distant sound of other horses moving in their stalls and the wind whispering through the eaves, they rested together. Two creatures the world had tried to discard, who'd found in each other the courage to prove that worth wasn't measured in pounds or dollars or practical utility. That sometimes the most valuable things were the ones that didn't fit any conventional mold. That being rejected by everyone could mean you were simply waiting for the one person, the one place, the one purpose that needed exactly what you were. Nothing more, nothing less. Just exactly, impossibly, perfectly enough.